Right, we're on a move. All right, everybody, thanks for joining. Really appreciate it, and have really appreciated all of the comments from everybody prior. At a high level, you guys have seen this slide in a sense. It's just showing that there might be, and probably will be, an increase or a decrease rather in solar over the next 5 years, highlighted by the yellow. A fun little slide to see what would have been and what will be. And I'm sure, as we all know in solar, this will change again probably in about 3 to 6 months with some other external shock that everybody in solar is getting used to over the last X number of years, I'm sure. All right, can we go to the next slide, Nadia? Excellent, thank you. So one of the things that I wanted to highlight for everybody is that states are hit in different forms and fashion. So you may be in a state which, when this tariff hits, which slows in a different percentile than another state. So if you look on the left-hand side, you can see that there's a lot of slowing in certain states. I call those on the border states, where these pennies per watt matter in the growth of the market. And then on the right-hand side, you can see it as in terms of total megawatts, where you've got a different selection of states, but you see a larger megawatt loss. For example, we all know that California is a very large solar market, and you see the megawatts come down pretty significantly on this chart. And the reason why I highlight this will come a little bit later in about a slide or two, where we talk about cash flows for installers. If you are in one of these states which is slowing and on the cusp because that 10 cents matters, you have to think very carefully about the size of your business, the people that you have on board, and your cash flows. If you're in one of these larger states, it's the same sort of thing, but there's a bit of different nuances to it. So I really want to take the angle of, if you are running a solar business, how would you want to think about this? And we'll cover that in a moment. Next slide. One of the things that we're not talking about on this phone call specifically is that there is another tariff coming down. And when we use all of the racking for solar, even though it's a smaller percentage of the total installation, it still is part of the installation cost. And we expect there to be a 20% tariff coming out in around April time period on aluminum. Now, the process isn't transparent, and unlike solar, where we get to see the recommendations for the tariff, we do not get to see the recommendations for the tariff around aluminum. It's under the national security guise. As such, we don't know exactly what the recommendation was, but all of our inclinations said it would be a 20% potential tariff. And what that means is essentially 1 to 2.5 cents a watt in addition on your balance of systems costs. And I think that's important because it's an additional cost that we can see as early as April. I think a lot of the supply chain will try to absorb that cost, but it is worth noting because it's another additional shock, one which is not as public, it is not as big, but it's worth really documenting as you think about your business and or what this means for the market, because it is an additional increase in cost. The same thing is happening and on the desk of the president around steel. Steel isn't used as much in most of the solar racking, but it is used often and used in standoffs and other things. So it's worth noting that that should also come out, a steel ruling, within the next 60 or 70 days. And the reason why I wanted to show this is I want everybody on the phone call to walk away with a general picture of what does the next 6 months look like and what are the shocks that can exist. We know, we have some great experts on the tariffs, but what are the other shocks that you might not be thinking about today that as you run your business or as you project this market, that you really should be taking it into consideration, because these are the things that we see on our supply side. Nadia, can you go to the next slide for me? Can we refresh this one? This is an older slide. I don't know if you're able to refresh, but I don't think that is a slide we want. It's a beautiful slide, though. Ooh, this little baby. So thanks everybody for your patience, and I think you're getting to see Nadia's baby. Only part of him though, but he is adorable. All right, excellent. So it's a bit different of a title than the last one that used to be in its place. What I wanted to do is walk through with you guys a little bit of the idea of, if you are running a business, how do you think about running your business and the working capital that goes around your business? So if you're a utility and you get hit with a 10 cents per watt change in price point, and granted this could be plus or minus depending on what materials you're using, But you know, if you're thinking about installing for $1 per watt as a utility, and all of a sudden you have a 10% change in that price point, and you've already priced out your contract a year ahead of time. You're hoping on growth, and you know, we're not even talking about steel or aluminum pricing playing into this. You have to have a net income, a profit margin of 10% essentially to stomach this type of increase. And so when we see what's happening with utilities, utility solar, you can understand why this would be a big deal and why this will shrink the market, and why this also changes the pricing that might have been given out a year ago for a contract that's going to be installed the next year. And so it's just worth noting that when you think about the cash that a company who is an installer has, as they go through finishing their pipeline, they could very well be burning cash, but be using the growth and the other contracts to kind of fund as they decline in profitability. And so I think it's a really, really important thing to note that if the markets are tight on modules, as Vince mentioned, and if we have this tariff in place, that you can really have some interesting shocks that are unfortunate to larger companies playing in the space, especially in such slim margins as utility contracts, where in a lot of cases, contracts can be priced on future pricing, which has been expected at some points to be down. So it's worth noting and understanding that. And if you're in the utility space, really, really thinking about it, you can get ahead of these things. And I really tell you that 3 to 6 months of getting ahead of it really makes a big difference. On the commercial contracts, if you think about the timeline on that, you usually sign these things 4 to 6 months prior. A 10-cent tariff means a 7 to 8% increase in total cost. I see 5,000 solar installers' income statements and balance sheets, and I'll tell you that a 7 to 8% net income is a healthy net income for a lot of our installers across the United States. And as such, when you think about what this does, when you have a price shift of this nature, and if it goes into the pipeline of these commercial contracts for contractors, it essentially limits the profitability over the next 6 months for the contracts that have been placed and are going to be installed at certain prices, if the prices haven't been included, which often you can have a tariff price be up or down in a contract. But if not, it's something to really consider, because what that does is it means you could go without profitability. You could go negative for a good 4 to 6 months, even though you may price it in the future. In return to profitability, you have to think about the cash flows that you have over the next 4 to 6 months to make sure you get there. You have to think about your head count. You have to think about where your costs are. You have to think about if you want these contracts or if you have to renegotiate them. Often we see that people try to push through it, but what they don't think about is the long-term nature of how hard it is to get back out of this. Because if you start having negative income, then your credit lines that you were depending on for working capital from your suppliers can often go away. If those go away, you don't have enough net income to actually, you don't have enough, working capital or dollars to borrow and build the projects, in which case we see that installers will go and get very expensive debt, which then burdens the company even further. So what I'm saying is everybody can get ahead of it. That's why we're talking about it now. But it's really, really, really important to be thinking about what your cash flows are in the short term as you deal with these types of shocks, and what that means for your head count, what that means for the contracts you should say no to, and what that means for solar in general as a trend. Because as we know, there's always a published list of solar companies that go out of business, and it's usually the largest players doing the most work going out of business. And I challenge you guys, how do you make sure you're watching your cash flows in a non-traditional tight way, especially because of solar, to make sure that this doesn't happen to you? And in our world, I watch weekly cash flows. I look 4 to 5 months out, and I see every week the cash flows, and we adjust how we do business based off these shocks. And it's a heck of a process, but it means that we'll be around for a long time. On the residential contracts, you can have a 60 to 90-day sales installation process, and these tariffs really only represent a 3% increase on a $3 a watt project. The reason why I bring this up, though, is often your overrides are not counting in these extra costs. Your projects are priced, and it's during low season. We're in Q1, and Q1 means slowness for solar. It means low cash flows. It means tightness. And if your product prices are going up, and you're not actually thinking about your working capital and overhead, you can find yourself, even with a 3% increase, in a bad place. And the reason why I say this is I see a lot of these balance sheets and income statements, and 3% isn't still a bad net income in solar because everybody is trying to grow. And the reason also why I caution everybody and look at each one of the states specifically, and when we go back to that slide, and I mentioned it earlier, I said we'll come back to this slide, the short of it is, if your state is shrinking in volume and you are expecting to have the same headcount in your business and have the same growth that you might have had in the past and have a higher increase in the cost of your products, And if you're losing money and your credit lines might go away, you really need to sit down immediately and think about your strategy so you can be around. There is nothing more important than taking a day or two to go through those financials, get somebody who knows it, and make it happen. You wouldn't harp on this if you weren't me and you weren't seeing across the solar industry all of the financials and all the aspects. I want our industry to be successful. I want to make sure you guys get over this hump, and I want to make sure we as an industry win, because I can tell you that, you know, unsubsidized solar across the world is 3 to 4 cents a kilowatt, sorry. When you look at the levelized cost of energy, it's going to win. I want everybody who is on this call to win together with us. Can we just go to the next slide real quick? These are the different shocks we expect, and I want to go ahead and explain due to time the cool lines that are on the right-hand side of this page. But in short, 50 gigawatts went into China last year as far as solar demand. They upped their volumes in China, which is in many ways a subsidy to their specific market and a subsidy to the manufacturers. It's made and stabilized the manufacturing market in a meaningful way. And honestly, for the manufacturers, it's a very, very good thing because it's creating demand. But the reason why I call this out is, let's say that tomorrow China says, you know what, it's May, June, July. You know, there is, you know, we're decided we've done enough solar this year. We're not going to have the same level of subsidy. It's called a tariff over there. Well, what happens is you get a massive amount of supply. You could have 25 gigawatts, you could have 10 gigawatts, you could have a large amount of supply come onto the market. Now, because there are some of these decisions which are coming up in Q3, Q4, if you look at the right-hand side of that graph, you just kind of see this straight shooting up line. It means that there could actually be an oversupply situation. So we could see a price decrease in modules at the end of the year. Now, because it's policy and China can switch it, and they did this last year, those expectations aren't necessarily fully real. But it's worth noting that because they control so much demand and the US market is so much smaller, you could see a pretty massive shift in pricing and supply pretty instantaneously if they decide to change their policy. So I want to make sure everybody understands kind of that bigger macroeconomic picture in addition to what Vince said about India. Next slide, please. You know, there's also the option, I want to let you guys just know the full landscape. There's the option for $1.3 billion of money is probably sitting in that trade case settlement that people will want to work to solve that. And I can tell you that, you know, for years they've been working to solve it, but there's a good chance that this could be solved in the next 4 to 8 months. And if a trade case is solved, then these tariffs could all of a sudden go away, or they could be reduced, or they could be changed. All of these things happen. And the incentive to solve it is that $1.3 billion of money sitting in a fund with the US government that has been the tariffs on all the modules coming in over the last big chunk of time, that money gets distributed. It gets distributed if there's a settlement and everybody agrees to US manufacturers who are and were driving the tariffs in the first place. It gets potentially distributed back to some of the manufacturers who have paid a very large amount into it. And then there's certain trade things that get settled. So there's a lot of incentive. It's not an easy thing to settle, and it's been going on for a while, but there's a lot of incentive to try to settle something like that. And the reason why I bring it up is we could see that happen in 4 to 8 months. We could also see that happen in 3 years or never. But it's worth just noting that what happens when or if tariffs go away, and how do you think about your business? But I don't want people banking on it, but it's just not something that everybody knows or hears about often. And I wanted to make sure we all know that landscape. It's so important that as we think through this with our businesses and or our analysis, that we actually consider all of the external factors that could shock our little industry, little but growing. All right, next slide. Drum roll, next slide. Thank you. So I also wanted to give you guys a little bit of an insight, a little back of the envelope analysis. If I was a manufacturer, would I build in the United States? And this is just more for fun because it doesn't matter as much to most people on this phone call. But, you know, it's really interesting to see how much it costs to set up a module manufacturer for those who don't know all of the economics. And I'm sure that Vince could probably correct me on a few of these things. That's why I said back of the envelope. You know, the envelope is still wet with the ink. But to give you guys an idea, for $2 million, you can buy new equipment to run a 100 megawatt automated manufacturing line for module production. This does not sell. This doesn't require gas. It does require power and big power lines, but you can run that. And the $500,000 for the facility, if you're renting it and not buying it, you can kind of set this up. It does take you a bit of time to set it up, but you can set it up. And what this comes down to when you actually look at it, is you look at about a 6% increase over China in the cost of producing solar panels in the United States. If you can get the cells from China and you're under that 2 gigawatt volume that doesn't get tariff that comes in the United States. Well, that doesn't sound so bad if we've got a 10 cent a watt tariff coming. But you also have to recognize that there's plenty of ups and downs here, and there's some, you can see the small font at the bottom of this page. But, it's plus or minus. It just depends on how you're setting it up, where you're setting it up. If you set it up in California, it can be more. If you set it up in a different state, it can be less. But the short of it is that could be pretty entertaining. But keep in mind that the tariffs only last for a few years. And these facilities need to be depreciated typically over a longer period of time, even though I've actually added the depreciation cost in here over 5 years, which is, you could potentially use bonus depreciation, a lot of other complexity. On the right-hand side, you see cell manufacturing. Just to give you guys an idea, for 100 megawatts of cell manufacturing, we're talking $10 million of volume. We're also talking another $1 million on top of that for other costs. And, if you look at that, that's another 4 cents. So you can see kind of how we get to 10 cents of really producing in the United States as far as how the tariff may have come to be. But in short, it's interesting to know that these different pieces can exist. Now, setting up a cell manufacturer is a lot longer process. You're looking at potentially 8 to 14 months, in which case you're partially or significantly through the tariff. So it might not be the best idea if you're trying to use that to set it up. So what we might see in the United States is a lot of people taking advantage on the manufacturing side, if they go that route, of module manufacturing. It's cheaper, it has a faster setup time, it can actually make good sense, and if you buy the equipment used, you actually have a lower cost to produce than this. But I hope you just find this entertaining. It's just neat to know what the supply chain does and the cost structures, so you can think about that as you think about why people do what they do. And then finally, I'll close out with the next slide. This is just, we basically have a 10 cent a watt panel tariff, plus or minus a little bit, depending on what you're bringing in and the quality / price that it comes into the United States. It could be higher, it could theoretically be lower. You also have something you need to be thinking about, which is the aluminum steel tariffs. And those can add cost to this.